stay? Will he go? Now we're going to have a look at Jeremy Corbyn's chart. Okay, so Jeremy Corbyn is a Gemini, and very similar to Nigel Farage. They both like that 70s band, Earth, Wind and Fire, because in their charts they've got Earth, Wind, Earth, air and fire, and no water planets for either of them, which means on the surface of things they're not very emotional, and it also means they don't have an obvious vulnerability or an obvious Achilles heel on display. That makes them quite interesting candidates to have a look at. So I think that's about where comparisons with Nigel Farage end, but I do have a comparison here. Jupiter in the first house, also similar to Hillary Clinton, that particular one. So Jeremy Corbyn he's just Sagittarius rising, so he's just on the cusp there of Sagittarius before it moves into Capricorn. So Sagittarius rising and Jupiter in the first house, which often indicates someone quite flamboyant, someone with flair, and you wouldn't have thought that of Jeremy Corbyn because he's usually rather frugally dressed. But if you'll remember, just before the referendum, he arrived to take part in a satire comedy show in a white Bentley with this fur coat draped around him. So that day he really was getting into his Jupiter in the first house. But I think the Jupiter in the first house is why he appeals to a lot of people at grassroots level. He offers optimism, hope, something exciting, something seen as different. He's all about social equality and about fair play, justice, human rights. He comes across as very strongly espousing values and is seen as a little bit different. I think what also we have here with Jeremy Corbyn is he's got 3 planets, or 4 planets actually, in Gemini. He's got his Sun, Mercury, Venus and Uranus, all packed into Gemini, all in the 6th house. Now the 6th house is also the house of trade unions, and that is where Jeremy Corbyn came up. He didn't have the same route as the likes of Cameron and Osborne, where they kind of went to Oxford and Cambridge and then had jobs either in politics or in the political machinery. He came up through the trade unions, and he did go to a grammar school, but he didn't pursue further education. He got kind of stuck in at the nitty-gritty and worked his way up that way, and that kind of makes him an authentic and different candidate. Now, because he has Uranus on the descendant, that tells me that he's an activist, and he's very popular with people who are activists and people who are looking for something new, something different, something anti-establishment, which is exactly what he represents. Now, the other thing that I wanted to say about Jeremy Corbyn, when I look at his chart, we also have 2 planets in Taurus. His moon is conjunct Mars in Taurus, which is square to Pluto. So he's a fighter. He's got a lot of stickability about him. He's got guts. He's going to hang in there. He's not a person who quits, and he's not afraid, similar in that way to Nigel Farage, he's not afraid of taking other people head on. I think he feels very strongly that he has a mandate with the people, and that is reinforced by what I see here in his solar arc directions, where solar arc Uranus is squaring his Sun, which is in the 6th house. Now, normally, when you see Uranus squaring the Sun, it represents disruption, change, that there's going to be a change, of course, in that person's life direction. But I feel in this case, Uranus placed just there on the ascendant, falling into the 6th house in Gemini, talks to me all about his public appeal, his appeal with the people at grassroots. And so the fact that Uranus is now activating his Sun tells me that the very reason that he is liked by people for being different, anti-establishment and in tune with the people, is a reason he's going to stay on for a while. And I definitely see that he is not going to go anywhere in the near future. We'll have to look at his chart again in 2 years' time, because that also shows some movement when Sun comes to conjunct his Pluto. That is a time when he may be able to cement himself a little bit more and gain even more popularity. So at the moment I'm looking at this chart and I'm thinking that Jeremy Corbyn's not going anywhere anytime soon. I thought it might be worth mentioning the 6th house is not only the house of trade unions, it's also the house of health and animals. And I believe that Jeremy Corbyn's a vegetarian and a teetotaler. He very rarely drinks. So he's someone who's very conscious of health, which befits all these planets in the 6th house. And he's also aware of not only human rights, workers' rights, animal rights as well. So he's very strong in all those fields. Now, with his Jupiter in the first, there's definitely more potential for him to evolve as a leader, and he is definitely able to tap into and express views that are not expressed by a lot of people. I don't think necessarily that this chart shows someone that's going to be the Prime Minister, but in terms of the general election in 2020, but I do see someone whose time has come. He's definitely found a role at a particularly unique time in British politics where he's expressing a view that needs to be expressed. This is a reformist time in British politics. People are moving away from the centre ground. They're tired of these two parties you have, the Tories and Labour, where you can't fit a cigarette paper between them. He's now creating something that's different. And as we've seen from Nigel Farage, what's different works. And Jeremy Corbyn, he was a very reluctant Brexiteer. We must remember he's always been highly Eurosceptic. And as we can see from the Labour heartlands up in the northeast of the country, northwest, the Midlands, a lot of Labour voters were voting out, which I feel gives Jeremy Corbyn, as the kind of shy Brexiteer, a great mandate to stay on, and probably as the ideal person at the moment to carry on leading the Labour Party. At the moment, of course, we know Angela Eagle's thrown her name into the ring. Now, I feel as a person who didn't, very different to Andrea Leadsom, Angela Eagle didn't perform well in the debate. She was only involved in one of the debates, and I remember her being stood there between Amber Rudd on the one side and Nicola Sturgeon on the other side. Now, okay, granted, it's kind of hard to create a good impression when you're between those two, because one was really giving its stick this side and the Amber Rudd was also having a lot to say over on that side. So Angela Eagle, it was difficult for her to make an impression, but she didn't come across particularly strongly in that debate, and I don't feel that did her chances going forward any good. Whereas Jeremy Corbyn, like Theresa May in a way, also stood back. He kept his head down during the whole Brexit campaign and kept his options open, which, hey, that's what Gemini are all about, aren't they? When the going gets tough, the tough sit on the fence. Hey, that's a saying you never heard before, but maybe it is a saying that should become popular with Geminis. Geminis know that if you want to survive, you don't alienate people. And if you nail your colours very strongly to one mast, then immediately you're losing support in another sector. So I think what Jeremy Corbyn did quite well during the whole referendum was keep his head down, not nail his colours too strongly to the Remain mast, and therefore he's kept his options open and remains credible. So I'm interested to, now I've looked at Jeremy Corbyn's chart, I'm a lot more interested in him as a person. I feel he is authentic, and I look forward to seeing more of him.